Hello, and welcome back to Stress Control Session 3, Part 2. So, in this part, we're going to have a look at how to control panic by controlling your body, changing your breathing, challenging your behaviours, and challenging your thoughts. So, in terms of controlling your body, remember the skills that I asked you to practice after last week's session. This is why. So caffeine, sugar and alcohol can all contribute to how our bodies react. By reducing how much caffeine and alcohol we drink and how much sugar is in our diet, we can start to have a positive effect on our body's reactions and help to slow them down. This will in turn slow down our breathing rate. We can also practice relaxation, such as progressive muscle relaxation, as we practiced last week. This is a technique where you move up and down the body, squeezing, holding and releasing each of the muscle groups as you go. We can also increase the amount of exercise that we do, as this can help with using up the excess energy, but also clear out our minds of negative thoughts, which might act as a trigger for our panic. So in terms of controlling your breathing, we practiced relaxation breathing techniques last session, and just building on that, I want you to try diaphragmatic breathing, which can help reduce panic and hyperventilation. So let's have a go now. So place one hand on your chest and then put the other hand on your belly. Now breathe slowly in through your nose and concentrate on filling up your lungs, in which you should see your belly move, but your chest lie flat. Now just pause for a moment and then slowly empty your lungs by breathing out through your mouth and dropping the belly until it flattens. So again, you've got one hand on your chest, one hand on your belly. Breathe slowly in through your nose, fill up your lungs. You'll notice your belly move and your chest should be flat. Just pause and then slowly empty your lungs, breathing out through your mouth and dropping the belly until it flattens. That was a diaphragmatic breath. And I know it's not easy to do. You will have to practice it. But it talks you through doing that in your workbook. So take a look after the session and practice doing it by yourself. Again, if you can master that, it's a skill that you can access anywhere, anytime when you're out and about and you notice that you're starting to hyperventilate. You can quickly do your diaphragmatic breathing and stop a panic attack from emerging potentially. Now on to challenging your thoughts and your behaviours. So often we might engage in safety behaviours or just avoid places that we think might trigger our panic. And this feeds into the negative interpretations which could lead to panic. So safety behaviours are the things that we do to help manage a situation. It's like carrying diazepam in your pocket even though you've never had to take them, or only going to the shops with a friend, or maybe carrying around something like a rabbit's foot for good luck. These are all safety behaviours and they can really lower our confidence, because we end up giving all of the credit to the diazepam or to our friend or to that rabbit's foot instead of giving the credit to ourselves. We think we wouldn't have coped without those things, but we probably would have. So we deserve the credit, not that safety behaviour. Avoidance might be not going to busy places. It might be not going to work or not going to the doctors. But by not going to places, we never actually test out our fears. It's similar to safety behaviours in that we're doing something to prevent bad things from happening, when actually the chances are that nothing bad will happen. But unless we test this out, we wouldn't know. And like I said, this feeds into the negative interpretations, which could lead to panic. So maybe we get to the bus stop, but we realise that we've forgotten to pick up our diazepam. So we feel like we won't cope being able to get on the bus without it, and we start to panic and we rush back home to get it. Or maybe our friend can't come to the shops with us one day. Maybe they're busy doing something else. So we just don't go either because we don't feel that we're able to do it by ourselves. We've given all the credit to the safety behaviour, and we're ignoring the fact that actually we've been getting on the bus or we've been going shopping all that time. So, like I said, it's the interpretation which feeds into the panic, and we need to test it out. Otherwise, we'll never actually know what truly happens in those situations, as long as we avoid them or we use safety behaviours. Now, I want to tell you a story about Doris and the dragon, and this story will highlight the impact of avoidance and safety behaviours. So, Claire was walking home from the shops when she spotted her friend Doris on the opposite side of the road. She was frantically flapping her arms up and down, and so Claire shouted over to Doris, "Doris, are you okay?" And Doris replied, Yeah, I'm fine. I'm just keeping the dragons away." Claire said, "What dragons?" And Doris said, "Exactly. See, it works." So the thing is, we know there aren't dragons. So Doris is flapping her arms about, not doing anything. But unless she drops her safety behaviour of flapping her arms to keep the dragons away, she'll never actually learn that dragons don't really come. I do like this story. It's a funny story, but it's got an important message for us. So avoidance and safety behaviours don't actually manage the situation. So what I want you to do is have a think. What safety behaviours do you have? Make a list to identify them and try and be more aware of when you're doing them, so that you can face your fears and give yourself the credit for all the things that you achieve. Now, exposure. Exposure is a really useful technique to manage panic and anxiety. It's the planned confrontation to a feared situation or object. Its aim is to gradually expose you to the situations or objects that make you anxious or fearful, or that maybe you've been avoiding. We do this using a hierarchy of the feared situations or objects. So starting with easier situations which relate to the situation or object, starting off with the easier ones first, each time you expose yourself to those things, you remain with the anxiety symptoms for long enough. So that means without avoiding or escaping from it. And what you'll notice is the anxiety actually comes down naturally. The desired outcome would be that you would learn to no longer fear the situation or object like you did before, and it puts you back in control. This exposure curve shows what happens when we're stressed or anxious. Our anxiety responds to the situation. We have an increase of symptoms, like all of those that we looked at in the first half of today's session, those fight or flight symptoms that are really scary, but they're not dangerous. So these symptoms eventually wear off over time, and so our anxiety reduces over time, as you can see from the exposure curve. Now, this is a process known as habituation. Habituation is the natural reduction in anxiety that occurs when people allow themselves to remain in the presence of the feared situation or the feared object for a prolonged period of time. It's very, very different from avoidance. So with avoidance, the anxiety reduces quite sharply, but only when the person escapes the situation or gets away from the feared object. And the problem with this is that the fear still remains. And the next time that the person comes across the feared situation or object, their anxiety levels will just be the same as before, and a pattern of avoidance is created. This is what leads to the vicious cycle. But in exposure, habituation means that subsequent exposure provokes less anxiety than before. Look at these graphs. So these graphs demonstrate how we would expect your anxiety to be affected when you complete exposure tasks. So the first graph, it shows that if you stay in the anxiety-provoking situation for about 60 minutes, or until your anxiety reduces by at least 50%, it will naturally reduce over time. And graph 2 explains that by repeating the same activity, it will gradually become easier in terms of the anxiety levels as you become used to being in that situation. And this is the habituation. So meaning that you no longer fear the situation that you originally feared and start to get used to it. So as you can tell, it's not a quick fix for the anxiety. Exposure takes time to work because basically you're retraining your brain, because the anxiety symptoms will naturally reduce, and we do learn then that the situation or object that we originally were afraid of is not actually what is causing us anxiety. So as a result, if we can do the exposure, we feel back in control and we don't have to carry on avoiding things anymore. So what to do in exposure? The first thing is to make a list of all the feared situations or objects that you've been avoiding. Then put those objects or situations in some kind of order, starting with the least feared thing at the bottom and working your way up to the most feared thing at the top. So there's a hierarchy diagram to do this in your workbooks. Then plan a place and a time where you're going to expose yourself to the least feared thing. So on the next page after the hierarchy in your workbook, there's a diary to help you do it. Then, once you've planned a place and a time to do the exposure, go ahead and do it. It's really important to do it and not to avoid or escape the situation too early, because what you're aiming for is habituation to take place. We'd aim for your anxiety to reduce by at least half before you end the exposure exercise, so don't leave prematurely. And then once you've done that, repeat it over and over. Do it 4 or 5 times a week until it no longer makes you feel anxious. And then you know you're ready to move on to the next step in your hierarchy. Like we said with behavioural activation, you can set the pace. So you can do this as many times over and over until you feel ready to move on to the next step. You can also use the breathing and relaxation techniques that we've taught in session 2 to help manage in these situations. But it's really important that you do keep yourself in the situations, even if it's uncomfortable, and just remind yourself that this feeling will pass. Habituation will take place. So this is the diary that's in your workbooks. By keeping a diary or a log, you can plan the exposure and see how far you've come. So an example that you might use exposure for is the fear of dogs. And a person who is afraid of dogs might avoid all of the places where dogs might be. So what they would need to do is, first off, make a list of all the situations they've been avoiding because of the fear of dogs, like their friend's house because they've got a dog, or going into the local park because people walk their dogs there. Then they would order all of these situations, starting with the least feared at the bottom of the hierarchy, going up to the most feared. So using the hierarchy in the workbook. So at the bottom of the hierarchy, this is the least feared situations. It might just be something like looking at photos of dogs to get started, because that's still anxiety provoking for them, but it's a good starting point. Then the next part might be to just talk about dogs, because talking about dogs to a friend or a family member gives them anxiety. The next step might be that they move on to watching videos of dogs on YouTube. And then towards the middle of the hierarchy, working their way up to more feared situations, it might be being close to a friend's dog while their friend holds it on a lead. Then they might move on to being in the park, but maybe at the quiet end of the park where there's not that many dogs about. Then maybe the next time they go to the park again, but they go where it's a little bit busier. So each time they're pushing themselves to face their fears. Maybe towards the top of the hierarchy, it's being close to dogs that aren't on the lead. And maybe right at the top of the hierarchy, it would be being able to stroke the dog. And you can see by me talking you through that hierarchy, how that person would slowly but surely face their fear of dogs. And if they work through all of those exposure tasks, they'd be able to conquer their fear. So what they do is they plan their first exercise into the diary. Remember we said be specific about what you're going to do, where you're going to do it, who you're going to do it with. And remember the first exercise in the exposure hierarchy was just to look at photos of dogs. So they'd plan that in and then they'd go ahead and do it. So just looking at photos of dogs until their anxiety reduces by at least half. And now, like we said, this might take some time. As you can see on the example on the exposure diary, they initially rated their anxiety whilst doing that task as being 6 out of 10. So before they even started getting the photographs out, their anxiety was a 6 out of 10 just thinking about having to do that. Then during the exercise, their anxiety went up. So remember that exposure curve, the anxiety goes up, the physical symptoms start coming into play, and they rated their anxiety as being 9 out of 10. So at the end of the exercise, they know they were ready to finish the exercise because their anxiety had halved. It had come down to 3 out of 10. They felt much calmer. They didn't feel completely calm. It's not a 0. They felt much calmer by the end of the exercise. Okay. And they would do this over and over. So keep on looking at photos of dogs, repeating this 4 or 5 times a week if need be. And once they felt that that exposure exercise wouldn't really provoke too much anxiety in them anymore, they would then be ready to move on to their next step of the hierarchy. So like we said, the next step of the hierarchy would be to just talk about dogs to friends and family members. And they'd repeat the whole process again, using that step of the hierarchy until they got right up until the top of the hierarchy, which was to be able to stroke a dog. So that's just one example of how you might use exposure, but I hope you could start to see ways in which you might confront your fears and work through exposure for the things that you've been avoiding. Okay. So in summary, today we've talked about the vicious cycle. We know that we tend to reduce our activities or avoid situations to be able to cope. But although in the short term, this can give us a bit of relief, in the long term, it will just make us feel worse because we're likely to want to do those things even less, the more that we put them off and the more that we avoid things. So behaviours do really have a big impact on how we feel. If we're doing less activities, whether that be routine activities, pleasurable activities, necessary activities, we get less sense of achievement and less pleasure in our lives. So that vicious cycle keeps on going, and the depression, the low mood keeps us feeling low. And in terms of anxiety, the avoidance that anxiety drives us to do makes us feel like we can't cope in situations. So again, avoidance only gives us that short-term relief. Long-term, it maintains the anxiety. We've spoken about how to change these behaviours. So in terms of behavioural activation that we looked at in the first half of today's session, which is a technique that aims us to slowly increase our activity levels at a pace in which we choose. And it's having a good mix of different activities, like we said, routine activities, pleasurable activities, as well as necessary activities. We need a balance in all those areas of our lives. And we also spoke about changing those behaviours in terms of exposure, a technique for overcoming anxiety that we've just looked at. We then went on to talk about panic and the effect of hyperventilation when we're starting to feel stressed and anxious and panicky. And knowing about that helps us in turn to manage the panic. So we spoke about managing our panic in terms of our body. So like we've already spoken about, reducing caffeine, sugar and alcohol, practicing the progressive muscle relaxation technique, and as well as relaxed breathing. And we spoke specifically about diaphragmatic breathing today. In terms of our body, there's also doing exercise, which we spoke about last session, but can help burn off some of that excess energy that we don't use up when we're starting to feel stressed and panicky because we've got all the energy to go for a run when actually we're just sat at home worrying. And then in terms of our thoughts and behaviour and managing those, we talked about reducing our safety behaviours. So the things that we do that make us feel better able to cope, but actually are reducing our confidence and our self-esteem because we end up giving them all the credit when they don't deserve it. And we also talked about tackling avoidance in terms of exposure. Okay, so for a bit of homework from today's session, try to challenge and change your behaviours by creating a diary and planning in some of your activities again. So whether that be routine, pleasurable or necessary, make sure there's a good balance in your diary between all of the things that you're doing, so you can slowly start to build your activity levels again and start leading your life, living your life how you want to live it. Practice the diaphragmatic breathing. Like I say, it talks through that in your workbook. And also think about and try out exposure if you do feel that you're avoiding things. Remember, part of that is reducing the safety behaviours as well. So that's the end of session 3, part 2. Next session, session 4, is about controlling the thoughts, which I think is a really useful session for most people. So I will see you again shortly for session 4. Thank you for today.